Chapters 12 and 13 of The Invisible Man. This recording is in the public domain. The Invisible Man by H.G. Wells. Chapter 12. The Invisible Man loses his temper. It is unavoidable that at this point the narrative should break off again, for a certain very painful reason that will presently be apparent. While these things were going on in the parlour, and while Mr. Huxter was watching Mr. Marvel smoking his pipe against the gate, not a dozen yards away were Mr. Hall and Teddy Henfrey discussing in a state of cloudy puzzlement the one Iping topic. Suddenly there came a violent thud against the door of the parlour, a sharp cry, and then silence.
"Hallo!"
said Teddy Henfrey.
"Hallo!"
from the tap. Mr. Hall took things in slowly but surely.
"That ain't right,"
he said, and came round from behind the bar towards the parlour door. He and Teddy approached the door together, with intent faces. Their eyes considered.
"Summat wrong,"
said Hall, and Henfrey nodded agreement. Whiffs of an unpleasant chemical odour met them, and there was a muffled sound of conversation, very rapid and subdued.
"You all right there?"
asked Hall, rapping. The muttered conversation ceased abruptly, for a moment's silence. Then the conversation was resumed, in hissing whispers, then a sharp cry of
"No, no, you don't!"
There came a sudden motion, and the oversetting of a chair, a brief struggle. Silence again.
"What the deuce!"
exclaimed Henfrey, sotto voce.
"You all right there?"
asked Mr. Hall sharply, again. The vicar's voice answered with a curious jerking intonation.
"Quite right. Please don't interrupt." "Odd,"
said Mr. Henfrey.
"Odd,"
said Mr. Hall.
"Says don't interrupt,"
said Henfrey.
"I heerd un,"
said Hall.
"And a sniff,"
said Henfrey. They remained listening. The conversation was rapid and subdued.
"I can't," said Mr. Bunting, his voice rising. "I tell you, sir, I will not." "What was that?"
asked Henfrey.
"Says he will not," said Hall. "Weren't speaking to us, was he?"
"Disgraceful," said Mr. Bunting within.
"Disgraceful,"
said Mr. Henfrey.
"I heard it distinct." "Who's that speaking now?"
asked Henfrey.
"Mr. Cuss, I s'pose," said Hall.
"Can you hear
anything?"
Silence, the sounds within indistinct and perplexing.
"Sounds like throwing the tablecloth about,"
said Hall. Mrs. Hall appeared behind the bar. Hall made gestures of silence and invitation. This aroused Mrs. Hall's wifely opposition.
"What you listening there for, Hall?" she asked. "Ain't you nothing better to do? Busy day like this."
Hall tried to convey everything by grimaces and dumb show, but Mrs. Hall was obdurate. She raised her voice. So Hall and Henfrey, rather crestfallen, tiptoed back to the bar, gesticulating to explain to her. At first she refused to see anything in what they had heard at all. Then she insisted on Hall keeping silence, while Henfrey told her his story. She was inclined to think the whole business nonsense. Perhaps they were just moving the furniture about.
"I heerd un say disgraceful, that I did," said Hall. "I heerd that, Mrs. Hall," said Henfrey.
"Like as not," began Mrs. Hall.
"Hush!"
said Mr. Teddy Henfrey.
"Didn't I hear the window?"
"What window?" said Mrs. Hall.
"Parlour window," said
Henfrey. Every one stood listening intently. Mrs. Hall's eyes, directed straight before her, saw without seeing the brilliant oblong of the inn door, the road white and vivid, and Huxter's shop front blistering in the June sun. Abruptly Huxter's door opened and Huxter appeared, eyes staring with excitement, arms gesticulating.
"Yap!" cried Huxter. "Stop thief!"
And he ran obliquely across the oblong towards the yard gates, and vanished. Simultaneously came a tumult from the parlour, and a sound of windows being closed. Hall, Henfrey, and the human contents of the tap rushed out at once pell-mell into the street. They saw some one whisk round the corner towards the road, and Mr. Huxter executing a complicated leap in the air that ended on his face and shoulder. Down the street people were standing astonished, or running towards them. Mr. Huxter was stunned. Henfrey stopped to discover this, but Hall and the two labourers from the tap rushed at once to the corner, shouting incoherent things, and saw Mr. Marvel vanishing by the corner of the church wall. They appeared to have jumped to the impossible conclusion that this was the Invisible Man suddenly become visible, and set off at once along the lane in pursuit. But Hall had hardly run a dozen yards before he gave a loud shout of astonishment and went flying headlong sideways, clutching one of the labourers and bringing him to the ground. He had been charged just as one charges a man at football. The second labourer came round in a circle, stared, and conceiving that Hall had tumbled over of his own accord, turned to resume the pursuit, only to be tripped by the ankle just as Huxter had been. Then, as the first labourer struggled to his feet, he was kicked sideways by a blow that might have felled an ox. As he went down, the rush from the direction of the village green came round the corner. The first to appear was the proprietor of the Cocoa Nut Shy, a burly man in a blue jersey. He was astonished to see the lane empty save for 3 men sprawling absurdly on the ground. And then something happened to his rearmost foot, and he went headlong and rolled sideways just in time to graze the feet of his brother and partner, following headlong. The two were then kicked, knelt on, fallen over, and cursed by quite a number of over-hasty people. Now when Hall and Henfrey and the labourers ran out of the house, Mrs. Hall, who had been disciplined by years of experience, remained in the bar next the till. And suddenly the parlour door was opened, and Mr. Cuss appeared, and without glancing at her, rushed at once down the steps toward the corner.
"Hold him!" he cried. "Don't let him drop that parcel!"
He knew nothing of the existence of Marvel, for the Invisible Man had handed over the books and bundle in the yard. The face of Mr. Cuss was angry and resolute, but his costume was defective, a sort of limp white kilt that could only have passed muster in Greece.
"Hold him!" he bawled. "He's got my trousers, and every stitch of the vicar's clothes. Tend to him in a minute," he cried to Henfrey as he passed the prostrate Huxter, and coming round the corner to join the tumult, was promptly knocked off his feet into an indecorous sprawl. Somebody in full flight trod heavily on his finger. He yelled, struggled to regain his feet, was knocked against and thrown on all fours again, and became aware that he was involved not in a capture but a rout. Every one was running back to the village. He rose again and was hit severely behind the ear. He staggered and set off back to the coach and horses forthwith, leaping over the deserted Huxter, who was now sitting up, on his way. Behind him, as he was half-way up the inn steps, he heard a sudden yell of rage, rising sharply out of the confusion of cries and a sounding smack in some one's face. He recognized the voice as that of the Invisible Man, and the note was that of a man suddenly infuriated by a painful blow. In another moment Mr. Cuss was back in the parlour. "He's coming back, Bunting," he said, rushing in. "Save yourself."
Mr. Bunting was standing in the window, engaged in an attempt to clothe himself in the hearthrug and a West Surrey Gazette.
"Who's coming?"
he said, so startled that his costume narrowly escaped disintegration.
"Invisible Man," said
Cuss, and rushed on to the window.
"We'd better clear out from here. He's fighting mad. Mad!"
In another moment he was out in the yard.
"Good heavens!"
said Mr. Bunting, hesitating between 2 horrible alternatives. He heard a frightful struggle in the passage of the inn, and his decision was made. He clambered out of the window, adjusted his costume hastily, and fled up the village as fast as his fat little legs would carry him. From the moment when the Invisible Man screamed with rage and Mr. Bunting made his memorable flight up the village, it became impossible to give a consecutive account of affairs in Iping. Possibly the Invisible Man's original intention was simply to cover Marvel's retreat with the clothes and books. But his temper, at no time very good, seems to have gone completely at some chance blow, and forthwith he set to smiting and overthrowing for the mere satisfaction of hurting. You must figure the street full of running figures, of doors slamming and fights for hiding places. You must figure the tumult suddenly striking on the unstable equilibrium of old Fletcher's planks and 2 chairs, with cataclysmic results. You must figure an appalled couple caught dismally in a swing. And then the whole tumultuous rush has passed, and the Iping street with its gauds and flags is deserted save for the still raging unseen, and littered with cocoanuts, overthrown canvas screens, and the scattered stock in trade of a sweetstuff stall. Everywhere there is a sound of closing shutters and shoving bolts, and the only visible humanity is an occasional flitting eye under a raised eyebrow in the corner of a window pane. The Invisible Man amused himself for a little while by breaking all the windows in the coach and horses, and then he thrust a street lamp through the parlour window of Mrs. Gribble. He it must have been who cut the telegraph wire to Adderdean just beyond Higgins Cottage on the Adderdean Road; and after that, as his peculiar qualities allowed, he passed out of human perceptions altogether, and he was neither heard, seen, nor felt in Iping any more. He vanished absolutely. But it was the best part of 2 hours before any human being ventured out again into the desolation of Iping Street. Chapter 13. Mr. Marvel discusses his resignation. When the dusk was gathering, and Iping was just beginning to peep timorously forth again upon the shattered wreckage of its Bank Holiday, a short, thick-set man in a shabby silk hat was marching painfully through the twilight behind the beechwoods on the road to Bramblehurst. He carried 3 books bound together by some sort of ornamental elastic ligature, and a bundle wrapped in a blue tablecloth. His rubicund face expressed consternation and fatigue. He appeared to be in a spasmodic sort of hurry. He was accompanied by a voice other than his own, and ever and again he winced under the touch of unseen hands. "If you give me the slip again," said the voice, "if you attempt to give me the slip again—"
"Lor!" said Mr. Marvel, "that shoulder's a mass of bruises as it is."
"On my honour," said the voice, "I will kill you."
"I didn't try to give you the slip," said Marvel, in a voice that was not far remote from tears. "I swear I didn't. I didn't know the blessed turning, that was all. How the devil was I to know the blessed turning? As it is, I've been knocked about."
"You'll get knocked about a great deal more if you don't mind," said the voice, and Mr. Marvel abruptly became silent. He blew out his cheeks, and his eyes were eloquent of despair. "It's bad enough to let these floundering yokels explode my little secret without your cutting off with my books. It's lucky for some of them they cut and ran when they did. Here am I. No one knew I was invisible. And now what am I to do?"
"What am I to do?"
asked Marvel, sotto voce. "It's all about. It will be in the papers. Everybody will be looking for me. Everyone on their guard." The voice broke off into vivid curses and ceased. The despair of Mr. Marvel's face deepened, and his pace slackened. "Go on," said the voice. Mr. Marvel's face assumed a greyish tint between the ruddier patches. "Don't drop those books, stupid," said the voice sharply, overtaking him. "The fact is," said the voice, "I shall have to make use of you. You're a poor tool, but I must."
"I'm a miserable tool," said Marvel.
"You are," said the voice.
"I'm the worst possible tool you could have," said Marvel. "I'm not strong," he said, after a discouraging silence. "I'm not over strong," he repeated.
"No?"
"And my heart's weak. That little business, I pulled it through, of course, but bless you, I could have dropped."
"Well?"
"I haven't the nerve and strength for the sort of thing you want."
"I'll stimulate you."
"I wish you wouldn't. I wouldn't like to mess up your plans, you know, but I might, out of sheer funk and misery."
"You'd better not," said the voice, with quiet emphasis.
"I wish I was dead," said Marvel. "It ain't justice," he said. "You must admit, it seems to me I've a perfect right—"
"Get on," said the voice. Mr. Marvel mended his pace, and for a time they went in silence again.
"It's devilish hard," said Mr. Marvel.
This was quite ineffectual. He tried another tack.
"What do I make by it?"
he began again in a tone of unendurable wrong.
"Oh, shut up,"
said the voice, with sudden amazing vigour. "I'll see to you all right. You do what you're told. You'll do it all right. You're a fool and all that, but you'll do."
"I tell you, sir, I'm not the man for it. Respectfully, but it is so."
"If you don't shut up, I shall twist your wrist again," said the invisible man. "I want to think." Presently 2 oblongs of yellow light appeared through the trees, and the square tower of a church loomed through the gloaming. "I shall keep my hand on your shoulder," said the voice, "all through the village. Go straight through, and try no foolery. It will be the worse for you if you do."
"I know that,"
sighed Mr. Marvel.
"I know all that."
The unhappy-looking figure in the obsolete silk hat passed up the street of the little village with his burdens, and vanished into the gathering darkness beyond the lights of the windows. Chapters 12 and 13. Chapters 14 and 15 of The Invisible Man. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Invisible Man, by H.G. Wells. Chapter 14. At Port Stowe. 10 o'clock the next morning found Mr. Marvel, unshaven, dirty, and travel stained, sitting with the books beside him and his hands deep in his pockets, looking very weary, nervous, and uncomfortable, and inflating his cheeks at infrequent intervals, on the bench outside a little inn on the outskirts of Port Stowe. Beside him were the books, but now they were tied with string. The bundle had been abandoned in the pine woods beyond Bramblehurst, in accordance with a change in the plans of the Invisible Man. Mr. Marvel sat on the bench, and although no one took the slightest notice of him, his agitation remained at fever heat. His hands would go ever and again to his various pockets with a curious nervous fumbling. When he had been sitting for the best part of an hour, however, an elderly mariner, carrying a newspaper, came out of the inn and sat down beside him. "Pleasant day," said the mariner. Mr. Marvel glanced about him with something very like terror. "Very," he said. "Just seasonable weather for the time of year," said the mariner, taking no denial. "Quite," said Mr. Marvel. The mariner produced a toothpick, and, saving his regard, was engrossed thereby for some minutes. His eyes meanwhile were at liberty to examine Mr. Marvel's dusty figure, and the books beside him. As he had approached Mr. Marvel, he had heard a sound like the dropping of coins into a pocket. He was struck by the contrast of Mr. Marvel's appearance with this suggestion of opulence. Thence his mind wandered back again to a topic that had taken a curiously firm hold of his imagination. "Books," he said suddenly, noisily finishing with the toothpick. Mr. Marvel started and looked at them. "Oh, yes," he said. "Yes, they're books." "There's some extraordinary things in books," said the mariner. "I believe you," said Mr. Marvel. "And some extraordinary things out of 'em," said the mariner. "True likewise," said Mr. Marvel. He eyed his interlocutor, and then glanced about him. "There's some extraordinary things in newspapers, for example," said the mariner. "There are." "In this newspaper," said the mariner. "Ah," said Mr. Marvel. "There's a story," said the mariner, fixing Mr. Marvel with an eye that was firm and deliberate. "There's a story about an invisible man, for instance." Mr. Marvel pulled his mouth askew, and scratched his cheek, and felt his ears glowing. "What will they be writing next?" he asked faintly. "Austria or America?" "Neither," said the mariner. "Here." "Lor!" said Mr. Marvel, starting. "When I say 'here,'" said the mariner, to Mr. Marvel's intense relief, "I don't of course mean 'ere in this place. I mean 'ereabouts." "An invisible man," said Mr. Marvel. "And what's he been up to?" "Everything," said the mariner, controlling Marvel with his eye, and then amplifying. "Every blessed thing." "I ain't seen a paper these 4 days," said Marvel. "'Appens the place he started at," said the mariner. "Indeed," said Mr. Marvel. "He started there, and where he came from nobody don't seem to know. Here it is. Peculiar story from Iping. And it says in this paper that the evidence is extraordinary strong. Extraordinary." "Lor!" said Mr. Marvel. "But then it's an extraordinary story. There's a clergyman and a medical gent witnesses, saw him all right and proper, or leastways didn't see him. He was staying, it says, at the Coach and Horses, and nobody don't seem to have been aware of his misfortune. It says, aware of his misfortune, until in an altercation in the inn, it says, his bandages on his head was torn off. It was then observed that his head was invisible. Attempts were at once made to secure him, but casting off his garments, it says, he succeeded in escaping, but not until after a desperate struggle, in which he had inflicted serious injuries, it says, on our worthy and able constable, Mr. J. A. Jaffers. Pretty straight story, eh? Names and everything." "Lor!" said Mr. Marvel, looking nervously about him, trying to count the money in his pockets by his unaided sense of touch, and full of a strange and novel idea. "Sounds most astonishing." "Don't it? Extraordinary, I call it. Never heard tell of invisible men before, I haven't, but nowadays one hears such a lot of extraordinary things. That—" "That all he did?" asked Marvel, trying to seem at his ease. "It's enough, ain't it?" said the mariner. "Didn't go back by any chance?" asked Marvel. "Just escape, and that's all, eh?" "All!" said the mariner. "Why, ain't it enough?"
Quite enough," said Marvel. "I should think it was enough," said the mariner. "I should think it was enough." "He didn't have any pals? Don't say he had any pals, does it?" asked Mr. Marvel, anxious. "Ain't one of the sort enough for you?" asked the mariner. "No, thank heaven, as one might say, he didn't." He nodded his head slowly. "Makes me regular uncomfortable, the bare thought of that chap running about the country. He is at present at large, and from certain evidence it is supposed that he has took, I suppose they mean, the road to Port Stowe. You see, we're right in it. None of your American wonders this time, and just think of the things he might do, where you'd be if he took a drop over and above and had a fancy to go for you. Suppose he wants to rob, who can prevent him? He can trespass, he can burgle, he can walk through a cordon of policemen as easy as me or you could give the slip to a blind man. Easier, for these here blind chaps hear uncommon sharp, I'm told, and wherever there was liquor he fancied." "He's got a tremendous advantage, certainly," said Mr. Marvel. "And, well, you're right," said the mariner. "He has." All this time Mr. Marvel had been glancing about him intently, listening for faint footfalls, trying to detect imperceptible movements. He seemed on the point of some great resolution. He coughed behind his hand. He looked about him again, listened, bent towards the mariner, and lowered his voice. "The fact of it is, I happen to know just a thing or two about this invisible man, from private sources." "Oh," said the mariner, interested. "You?" "Yes," said Mr. Marvel. "Me." "Indeed!" said the mariner. "And may I ask?" "You'll be astonished," said Mr. Marvel behind his hand. "It's tremenjous." "Indeed!" said the mariner. "The fact is," began Mr. Marvel eagerly in a confidential undertone. Suddenly his expression changed marvellously. "Ow!" he said. He rose stiffly in his seat. His face was eloquent of physical suffering. "Wow!" he said. "What's up?" said the mariner, concerned. "Toothache," said Mr. Marvel, and put his hand to his ear. He caught hold of his books. "I must be getting on, I think," he said. He edged in a curious way along the seat away from his interlocutor. "But you was just a going to tell me about this here invisible man," protested the mariner. Mr. Marvel seemed to consult with himself. "Hoax," said a voice. "It's a hoax," said Mr. Marvel. "But it's in the paper," said the mariner. "Hoax all the same," said Marvel. "I know the chap that started the lie. There ain't no invisible man whatsoever. Blimey! But how about this paper? Do you mean to say—" "Not a word of it," said Marvel stoutly. The mariner stared, paper in hand. Mr. Marvel jerkily faced about. "Wait a bit," said the mariner, rising and speaking slowly. "Do you mean to say—" "I do," said Mr. Marvel. "Then why did you let me go on and tell you all this blasted stuff then? What do you mean by letting a man make a fool of himself like that for, eh?" Mr. Marvel blew out his cheeks. The mariner was suddenly very red indeed. He clenched his hands. "I've been talking to you this 10 minutes," he said, "and you little pot-bellied, leathery-faced son of an old boot, couldn't have the elementary manners—" "Don't you come bandying words with me," said Mr. Marvel. "Bandying words! I'm a jolly good mind." "Come up," said a voice, and Mr. Marvel was suddenly whirled about and started marching off in a curious spasmodic manner. "You'd better move on," said the mariner. "Who's moving on?" said Mr. Marvel. He was receding obliquely, with a curious hurrying gait, with occasional violent jerks forward. Some way along the road he began a muttered monologue, protests and recriminations. "Silly devil," said the mariner, legs wide apart, elbows akimbo, watching the receding figure. "I'll show you, you silly arse. Hoaxing me. It's here, on the paper." Mr. Marvel retorted incoherently, and receding, was hidden by a bend in the road, but the mariner still stood magnificent in the midst of the way until the approach of a butcher's cart dislodged him. Then he turned himself towards Port Stowe. "Full of extraordinary arses," he said softly to himself. "Just to take me down a bit, that was his silly game. It's on the paper."
There was another extraordinary thing he was presently to hear, that had happened quite close to him, and that was a vision of a fistful of money, no less, travelling without visible agency, along by the wall at the corner of St. Michael's Lane. A brother mariner had seen this wonderful sight that very morning. He had snatched at the money forthwith, and had been knocked headlong, and when he had got to his feet the butterfly money had vanished. Our mariner was in the mood to believe anything, he declared, but that was a bit too stiff. Afterwards, however, he began to think things over. The story of the flying money was true, and all about that neighbourhood, even from the august London and Country Banking Company, from the tills of shops and inns, doors standing that sunny weather entirely open, money had been quietly and dexterously making off that day in handfuls and rouleaux, floating quietly along by walls and shady places, dodging quickly from the approaching eyes of men; and it had, though no man had traced it, invariably ended its mysterious flight in the pocket of that agitated gentleman in the obsolete silk hat, sitting outside the little inn on the outskirts of Port Stowe. It was 10 days after, and indeed only when the Burdock story was already old, that the mariner collated these facts and began to understand how near he had been to the wonderful invisible man. Chapter 15. The Man Who Was Running. In the early evening time Dr. Kemp was sitting in his study in the Belvedere on the hill overlooking Burdock. It was a pleasant little room, with 3 windows, north, west, and south, and bookshelves covered with books and scientific publications, and a broad writing table, and under the north window a microscope, glass slips, minute instruments, some cultures, and scattered bottles of reagents. Dr. Kemp's solar lamp was lit, albeit the sky was still bright with the sunset light, and his blinds were up because there was no offence of peering outsiders to require them pulled down. Dr. Kemp was a tall and slender young man, with flaxen hair and a moustache almost white, and the work he was upon would earn him, he hoped, the fellowship of the Royal Society, so highly did he think of it. And his eye, presently wandering from his work, caught the sunset blazing at the back of the hill that is over against his own. For a minute perhaps he sat, pen in mouth, admiring the rich golden colour above the crest, and then his attention was attracted by the little figure of a man, inky black, running over the hill brow towards him. He was a shortish little man, and he wore a high hat, and he was running so fast that his legs verily twinkled. "Another of those fools," said Dr. Kemp. "Like that 'oss who ran into me this morning round a corner with the visible man a coming, sir. I can't imagine what possesses people. One might think we were in the 13th century." He got up, went to the window, and stared at the dusky hillside, and the dark little figure tearing down it. "He seems in a confounded hurry," said Dr. Kemp, "but he doesn't seem to be getting on. If his pockets were full of lead he couldn't run heavier." "Spurted, sir," said Dr. Kemp. In another moment the higher of the villas that had clambered up the hill from Burdock had occulted the running figure. He was visible again for a moment, and again, and then again, 3 times between the 3 detached houses that came next, and then the terrace hid him. "'Osses," said Dr. Kemp, swinging round on his heel and walking back to his writing table. But those who saw the fugitive nearer, and perceived the abject terror on his perspiring face, being themselves in the open roadway, did not share in the doctor's contempt. By the man pounded, and as he ran he chinked like a well-filled purse that is tossed to and fro. He looked neither to the right nor the left, but his dilated eyes stared straight downhill to where the lamps were being lit and the people were crowded in the street, and his ill-shaped mouth fell apart, and a glary foam lay on his lips, and his breath came hoarse and noisy. All he passed stopped, and began staring up the road and down, and interrogating one another, with an inkling of discomfort for the reason of his haste. And then presently, far up the hill, a dog playing in the road yelped, and ran under a gate, and as they still wondered, something, a wind, a pad, 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 a sound like a panting breathing, rushed by. People screamed. People sprang off the pavement. It passed in shouts. It passed by instinct down the hill. They were shouting in the street before Marvel was half way there. They were bolting into houses and slamming the doors behind them, with the news. He heard it and made one last desperate spurt. Fear came striding by, rushed ahead of him, and in a moment had seized the town. "The Invisible Man is coming! The Invisible Man!" End of chapters 14 and 15. Chapters 16 and 17 of The Invisible Man. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Invisible Man, by H.G. Wells. Chapter 16. In the Jolly Cricketers. The Jolly Cricketers is just at the bottom of the hill, where the tram lines begin. The barman leaned his fat red arms on the counter and talked of horses with an anaemic cabman, while a black bearded man in grey snapped up biscuit and cheese, drank Burton, and conversed in American with a policeman off duty. "What's the shouting about?" said the anaemic cabman, going off at a tangent, trying to see up the hill over the dirty yellow blind in the low window of the inn. Somebody ran by outside. "Faugh, p'raps," said the barman. Footsteps approached, running heavily. The door was pushed open violently, and Marvel, weeping and dishevelled, his hat gone, the neck of his coat torn open, rushed in, made a convulsive turn, and attempted to shut the door. It was held half open by a strap.
"Come in!"
he bawled, his voice shrieking with terror.
"He's coming! The Invisible Man! After me! For God's sake, help! Help! Help!"
"Shut the doors," said the policeman. "Who's coming? What's the row?" He went to the door, released the strap, and it slammed. The American closed the other door.
"Let me go inside,"
said Marvel, staggering and weeping, but still clutching the books.
"Let me go inside. Lock me in. Somewhere. I tell you, he's after me. I've given the slip. He said he'd kill me, and he will."
"You're safe," said the man with the black beard. "The door's shut. What's it all about?"
"Let me go inside,"
said Marvel, and shrieked aloud as a blow suddenly made the fastened door shiver, and was followed by a hurried rapping and a shouting outside. "Hullo!" cried the policeman. "Who's there?" Mr. Marvel began to make frantic dives at panels that looked like doors.
"You kill me. He's got a knife or something. For God's sake."
"Here you are," said the barman. "Come in here," and he held up the flap of the bar. Mr. Marvel rushed behind the bar as the summons outside was repeated.
"Don't open the door," he screamed. "Please don't open the door. Where shall I hide?"
This Invisible Man, then?" asked the man with the black beard, with one hand behind him. "I guess it's about time we saw him." The window of the inn was suddenly smashed in, and there was a screaming and running to and fro in the street. The policeman had been standing on the settee staring out, craning to see who was at the door. He got down with raised eyebrows. "It's that," he said. The barman stood in front of the bar parlour door, which was now locked on Mr. Marvel, stared at the smashed window, and came round to the two other men. Everything was suddenly quiet. "I wish I had my truncheon," said the policeman, going irresolutely to the door. "Once we open, in he comes. There's no stopping him."
"Don't you be in too much hurry about that door,"
said the anaemic cabman, anxiously. "Draw the bolts," said the man with the black beard, "and if he comes—" He showed a revolver in his hand. "That won't do," said the policeman. "That's murder." "I know what country I'm in," said the man with the beard. "I'm going to let off at his legs. Draw them bolts." "Not with that blinkin' thing going off behind me," said the barman, craning over the blind. "Very well," said the man with the black beard, and stooping down, revolver ready, drew them himself. Barman, cabman, and policeman faced about. "Come in," said the bearded man in an undertone, standing back and facing the unbolted doors with his pistol behind him. No one came in. The door remained closed. 5 minutes afterwards, when a second cabman pushed his head in cautiously, they were still waiting, and an anxious face peered out of the bar parlour and supplied information.
"Are all the doors of the house shut?"
asked Marvel.
"He's going round, prowling round. He's as artful as a devil." "Good Lord!" said the burly barman. "There's the back. Just watch them doors. I say!" He looked about him helplessly. The bar parlour door slammed and they heard the key turn. "There's the yard door and the private door. The yard door." He rushed out of the bar. In a minute he reappeared with a carving knife in his hand. "The yard door was open," he said, and his fat underlip dropped. "He may be in the house now," said the first cabman. "He's not in the kitchen," said the barman. "There's 2 women there, and I've stabbed every inch of it with this little beef slicer, and they don't think he's come in. They haven't noticed." "Have you fastened it?" asked the first cabman. "I'm out of frocks," said the barman.
The man with the beard replaced his revolver. And even as he did so the flap of the bar was shut down and the bolt clicked, and then with a tremendous thud the catch of the door snapped and the bar parlour door burst open. They heard Marvel squeal like a caught leveret, and forthwith they were clambering over the bar to his rescue. The bearded man's revolver cracked and the looking glass at the back of the parlour starred and came smashing and tinkling down. As the barman entered the room he saw Marvel, curiously crumpled up and struggling against the door that led to the yard and kitchen. The door flew open while the barman hesitated and Marvel was dragged into the kitchen. There was a scream and a clatter of pans. Marvel, head down, and lugging back obstinately, was forced to the kitchen door, and the bolts were drawn. Then the policeman, who had been trying to pass the barman, rushed in, followed by one of the cabmen, gripped the wrist of the invisible hand that collared Marvel, was hit in the face and went reeling back. The door opened, and Marvel made a frantic effort to obtain a lodgment behind it. Then the cabman collared something. "I got him," said the cabman. The barman's red hands came clawing at the unseen. "Here he is," said the barman. Mr. Marvel, released, suddenly dropped to the ground and made an attempt to crawl behind the legs of the fighting men. The struggle blundered round the edge of the door. The voice of the invisible man was heard for the first time, yelling out sharply, as the policeman trod on his foot. Then he cried out passionately, and his fists flew round like flails. The cabman suddenly whooped and doubled up, kicked under the diaphragm. The door into the bar parlour from the kitchen slammed and covered Mr. Marvel's retreat. The men in the kitchen found themselves clutching at and struggling with empty air.
"Where's he gone?"
cried the man with the beard.
"Out?"
"This way," said the policeman, stepping into the yard and stopping. A piece of tile whizzed by his head and smashed among the crockery on the kitchen table.
"I'll show him,"
shouted the man with the black beard, and suddenly a steel barrel shone over the policeman's shoulder, and 5 bullets had followed one another into the twilight whence the missile had come. As he fired, the man with the beard moved his hand in a horizontal curve so that his shots radiated out into the narrow yard like spokes from a wheel. A silence followed. "5 cartridges," said the man with the black beard. "That's the best of all. 4 aces and a joker. Get a lantern, some one, and come and feel about for his body." Chapter 17. Dr. Kemp's Visitor. Dr. Kemp had continued writing in his study until the shots aroused him. Crack, crack, crack they came, one after the other. "Hullo!" said Dr. Kemp, putting his pen into his mouth again and listening. "Who's letting off revolvers in Berwick? What are the 'osses at now?" He went to the south window, threw it up, and leaning out stared down on the network of windows, beaded gas lamps and shops, with its black interstices of roof and yard that made up the town at night. "Looks like a crowd down the hill," he said, "by the cricketers," and remained watching. Thence his eyes wandered over the town to far away where the ship's lights shone, and the pier glowed, a little illuminated faceted pavilion like a gem of yellow light. The moon in its first quarter hung over the westward hill, and the stars were clear and almost tropically bright. After 5 minutes, during which his mind had travelled into a remote speculation of social conditions of the future, and lost itself at last over the time dimension, Dr. Kemp roused himself with a sigh, pulled down the window again, and returned to his writing desk. It must have been about an hour after this that the front door bell rang. He had been writing slackly, and with intervals of abstraction, since the shots. He sat listening. He heard the servant answer the door, and waited for her feet on the staircase, but she did not come. "Wonder what that was?" said Dr. Kemp. He tried to resume his work, failed, got up, went downstairs from his study to the landing, rang, and called over the balustrade to the housemaid as she appeared in the hall below. "Was that a letter?" he asked. "Only a runaway ring, sir," she answered. "I'm restless to night," he said to himself. He went back to his study, and this time attacked his work resolutely. In a little while he was hard at work again, and the only sounds in the room were the ticking of the clock and the subdued shrillness of his quill, hurrying in the very centre of the circle of light his lamp shade threw on his table. It was 2 o'clock before Dr. Kemp had finished his work for the night. He rose, yawned, and went downstairs to bed. He had already removed his coat and vest, when he noticed that he was thirsty. He took a candle and went down to the dining room in search of a syphon and whiskey. Dr. Kemp's scientific pursuits have made him a very observant man, and as he recrossed the hall He noticed a dark spot on the linoleum near the mat at the foot of the stairs. He went on upstairs, and then it suddenly occurred to him to ask himself what the spot on the linoleum might be. Apparently some subconscious element was at work. At any rate, he turned with his burden, went back to the hall, put down the syphon and whiskey, and, bending down, touched the spot. Without any great surprise, he found it had the stickiness and colour of drying blood. He took up his burden again, and returned upstairs, looking about him and trying to account for the blood spot. On the landing he saw something and stopped, astonished. The door handle of his own room was blood-stained. He looked at his own hand. It was quite clean, and then he remembered that the door of his room had been open when he came down from his study, and that consequently he had not touched the handle at all. He went straight into his room, his face quite calm, perhaps a trifle more resolute than usual. His glance, wandering inquisitively, fell on the bed. On the counterpane was a mess of blood, and the sheet had been torn. He had not noticed this before because he had walked straight to the dressing-table. On the further side the bedclothes were depressed as if some one had been recently sitting there. Then he had an odd impression that he had heard a low voice say: "Good heavens! Kemp!" But Dr. Kemp was no believer in voices. He stood staring at the tumbled sheets. Was that really a voice? He looked about again, but noticed nothing further than the disordered and blood-stained bed. Then he distinctly heard a movement across the room, near the wash-hand-stand. All men, however highly educated, retain some superstitious inklings. The feeling that is called eerie came upon him. He closed the door of the room, came forward to the dressing-table and put down his burdens. Suddenly, with a start, he perceived a coiled and blood-stained bandage of linen rag hanging in mid-air, between him and the wash-hand-stand. He stared at this in amazement. It was an empty bandage, a bandage properly tied, but quite empty. He would have advanced to grasp it, but a touch arrested him, and a voice speaking quite close to him. "Kemp," said the voice. "Eh?" said Kemp, with his mouth open. "Keep your nerve," said the voice. "I'm an invisible man." Kemp made no answer for a space, simply stared at the bandage. "Invisible man," he said. "I'm an invisible man," repeated the voice. The story he had been active to ridicule only that morning rushed through Kemp's brain. He does not appear to have been either very much frightened or very greatly surprised at the moment. Realization came later. "I thought it was all a lie," he said. The thought uppermost in his mind was the reiterated arguments of the morning. "Have you a bandage on?" he asked. "Yes," said the invisible man. "Oh," said Kemp, and then roused himself. "I say," he said, "but this is nonsense. It's some trick." He stepped forward suddenly, and his hand, extended towards the bandage, met invisible fingers. He recoiled at the touch, and his colour changed. "Keep steady, Kemp, for God's sake. I want help badly. Stop." The hand gripped his arm. He struck at it. "Kemp!" cried the voice. "Kemp, keep steady!" And the grip tightened. A frantic desire to free himself took possession of Kemp. The hand of the bandaged arm gripped his shoulder, and he was suddenly tripped and flung backwards upon the bed. He opened his mouth to shout, and the corner of the sheet was thrust between his teeth. The invisible man had him down grimly, but his arms were free, and he struck and tried to kick savagely. "Listen to reason, will you?" said the invisible man, sticking to him in spite of a pounding in the ribs. "By heaven, you'll madden me in a minute! Lie still, you fool!" bawled the invisible man in Kemp's ear. Kemp struggled for another moment and then lay still. "If you shout, I'll smash your face," said the invisible man, relieving his mouth. "I'm an invisible man. It's no foolishness and no magic. I really am an invisible man, and I want your help. I don't want to hurt you, but if you behave like a frantic rustic, I must. Don't you remember me, Kemp? Griffin, of University College?" "Let me get up," said Kemp. "I'll stop where I am, and let me sit quiet for a minute." He sat up and felt his neck. "I am Griffin, of University College, and I have made myself invisible. I am just an ordinary man. A man you have known, made invisible." "Griffin?" said Kemp. "Griffin," answered the voice. "A younger student than you were, almost an albino, 6 feet high and broad, with a pink and white face and red eyes, who won the medal for chemistry." "I'm confused," said Kemp. "My brain is rioting. What has this to do with Griffin?" "I am Griffin." Kemp thought. "It's horrible," he said. "But what devilry must happen to make a man invisible?" "It's no devilry. It's a process, sane and intelligible enough." "It's horrible," said Kemp. "How on earth—" "It's horrible enough, but I'm wounded and in pain and tired. Great God, Kemp, you are a man. Take it steady. Give me some food and drink, and let me sit down here." Kemp stared at the bandage as it moved across the room, then saw a basket chair dragged across the floor and come to rest near the bed. It creaked and the seat was depressed the quarter of an inch or so. He rubbed his eyes and felt his neck again. "This beats ghosts," he said, and laughed stupidly. "That's better. Thank heaven you're getting sensible." "Oh, silly," said Kemp, and knuckled his eyes. "Give me some whiskey. I'm near dead." "It didn't feel so. Where are you? If I get up, shall I run into you? There. All right. Whiskey? Here. Where shall I give it to you?" The chair creaked and Kemp felt the glass drawn away from him. He let go by an effort. His instinct was all against it. It came to rest poised 20 inches above the front edge of the seat of the chair. He stared at it in infinite perplexity. This must be hypnotism. You have suggested you are invisible." "Nonsense," said the voice. "It's frantic." "Listen to me." "I demonstrated conclusively this morning," began Kemp, "that invisibility—" "Never mind what you've demonstrated. I'm starving," said the voice, "and the night is chilly to a man without clothes." "Food?" said Kemp. The tumbler of whiskey tilted itself. "Yes," said the invisible man, rapping it down. "Have you a dressing gown?" Kemp made some exclamation in an undertone. He walked to a wardrobe and produced a robe of dingy scarlet. "This do?" he asked. It was taken from him. It hung limp for a moment in mid air, fluttered weirdly, stood full and decorous buttoning itself, and sat down in his chair. "Drawers, socks, slippers would be a comfort," said the unseen curtly. "And food." "Anything. But this is the insanest thing I ever was in my life." He turned out his drawers for the articles, and then went downstairs to ransack his larder. He came back with some cold cutlets and bread, pulled up a light table, and placed them before his guest. "Never mind knives," said his visitor, and a cutlet hung in mid air, with a sound of gnawing. "Invisible," said Kemp, and sat down on a bedroom chair. "I always like to get something about me before I eat," said the invisible man, with a full mouth, eating greedily. "Queer fancy." "I suppose that wrist is all right?" said Kemp. "Trust me," said the invisible man. "Of all the strange and wonderful—" "Exactly. But it's odd I should blunder into your house to get my bandaging. My first stroke of luck. Anyhow, I meant to sleep in this house to night. You must stand that. It's a filthy nuisance, my blood showing, isn't it? Quite a clot over there. Gets visible as it coagulates, I see. It's only the living tissue I've changed, and only for as long as I'm alive. I've been in the house 3 hours." "But how's it done?" began Kemp, in a tone of exasperation. "Confound it, the whole business! It's unreasonable from beginning to end." "Quite reasonable," said the invisible man. "Perfectly reasonable." He reached over and secured the whiskey bottle. Kemp stared at the devouring dressing gown. A ray of candle light penetrating a torn patch in the right shoulder made a triangle of light under the left ribs. "What were the shots?" he asked. "How did the shooting begin?" "There was a real fool of a man, a sort of confederate of mine, curse him, who tried to steal my money, has done so." "Is he invisible too?" "No." "Well? Can't I have some more to eat before I tell you all that? I'm hungry, in pain, and you want me to tell stories." Kemp got up. "You didn't do any shooting?" he asked. "Not me," said his visitor. "Some fool I'd never seen fired at random. A lot of them got scared. They all got scared at me. Curse them! I say, I want more to eat than this, Kemp." "I'll see what there is to eat downstairs," said Kemp. "Not much, I'm afraid." After he had done eating, and he made a heavy meal, the invisible man demanded a cigar. He bit the end savagely before Kemp could find a knife, and cursed when the outer leaf loosened. It was strange to see him smoking. His mouth and throat, pharynx and nares became visible as a sort of whirling smoke cast. "This blessed gift of smoking," he said, and puffed vigorously. "I'm lucky to have fallen upon you, Kemp. You must help me.
Fancy tumbling on you just now. I'm in a devilish scrape. I've been mad, I think. The things I've been through. But we will do things yet. Let me tell you." He helped himself to more whiskey and soda. Kemp got up, looked about him, and fetched a glass from his spare room. "It's wild, but I suppose I may drink." "You haven't changed much, Kemp, these dozen years. You fair men don't. Cool and methodical, after the first collapse. I must tell you, we will work together." "But how was it all done?" said Kemp. "And how did you get like this?" "For God's sake, let me smoke in peace for a little while, and then I will begin to tell you." But the story was not told that night. The Invisible Man's wrist was growing painful, he was feverish, exhausted, and his mind came round to brood upon his chase down the hill and the struggle about the inn. He spoke in fragments of marvel, he smoked faster, his voice grew angry. Kemp tried to gather what he could. "He was afraid of me. I could see that he was afraid of me," said the Invisible Man, many times over. "He meant to give me the slip. He was always casting about. What a fool I was! The cur! I should have killed him." "Where did you get the money?" asked Kemp, abruptly. The Invisible Man was silent for a space. "I can't tell you to night," he said. He groaned suddenly and leant forward, supporting his invisible head on invisible hands. "Kemp," he said, "I've had no sleep for near 3 days, except a couple of dozes of an hour or so. I must sleep soon. Well, have my room. Have this room. But how can I sleep? If I sleep, he will get away. Ah! What does it matter?" "What's the shot wound?" asked Kemp, abruptly. "Nothing. Scratch and blood. Oh, God, how I want sleep!" "Why not?" The Invisible Man appeared to be regarding Kemp. "Because I've a particular objection to being caught by my fellow men," he said slowly. Kemp started. "Fool that I am," said the Invisible Man, striking the table smartly. "I've put the idea into your head." Chapter 16 and 17